The research methods we've discussed so far, surveys and content analysis, are considered to be quantitative research methods because they involve measurement. Now, it is true that with a survey, you can pose some open-ended questions, which will give you qualitative data, but the vast majority of questions on a survey ask people to rate something on a numerical scale or else to check a box, in other words, check a category. And then the results end up being compiled in a spreadsheet and you run statistical tests to answer your research questions or test your hypotheses. Similarly, content analysis is considered to be a quantitative method because you are taking communication content, you are dividing it up into units, and then you are coding each of those units by placing it into a category, which is nominal measurement. Now, sometimes measurement may not be what you're trying to do, and quantitative methods may not be the best approach to answer your research question. You may not be looking for something that can be reduced to numbers. You may be looking for information that's more in depth, listening to people's stories or observing their experiences, in which case a qualitative approach may be the best option. If I were interested in different leadership styles that are used within an organization, and I wanted to know which leadership style the employees thought was the best of the bunch, that would lend itself to measurement. I would probably administer a survey and they would rank each of the different leadership styles from best to worst, or they would rate each one on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that. But maybe that's not really what I'm interested in. Maybe what I'm really interested in is finding out how those leadership styles are implemented or carried out, or how they manifest themselves in the day-to-day practices of that organization. And the only way I could probably find that out would be to actually go to the organization and observe what the employees and what the leaders of that organization do on a day-to-day basis, take really good notes, or perhaps do a series of in-depth interviews or focus groups with people from the organization. So qualitative research in communication can take different forms. 3 of the most common qualitative communication research methods are focus groups, depth, in other words, one-on-one in-depth interviews, and participant observation. And participant observation is where you, the researcher, would go into a natural setting and observe people and their everyday habits, their everyday routines. So you might actually observe people within a particular company or an organization, kind of in the same way that a cultural anthropologist might observe people from a different culture by spending several weeks or months embedded within that group of people to learn about their customs, to learn about their traditions. Similar story when it comes to communication research. The research method that we're going to focus in on most specifically is focus groups, because focus groups are quite popular in strategic communication. They are used commonly in public relations, as well as in marketing and advertising. So that's the qualitative method that we are going to focus on most specifically, but understand that there are others as well. So let's talk about some of the qualities of qualitative research. And we've already talked about some of this stuff earlier on in the term when we were comparing quantitative to qualitative research. One of the key differences is in the role of the researcher. A quantitative researcher, someone doing a survey, for example, strives to be objective and strives to be neutral, doesn't want their opinions or biases to cloud the research. So they try to be kind of hands-off, by which I mean they don't like hover over the research subjects while they're taking the survey. They don't, coach them on how to reply to the survey questions. They send out their invitation to participants, invite them to take the survey, but then they sort of step back and let people take the survey on their own time. So in a quantitative study, the researcher strives to be detached and not, get down and dirty with the actual participants of the study. It's an entirely different story when it comes to qualitative research. In qualitative studies, the researcher is more down and dirty with the actual research subjects or participants. So, for example, in a focus group, the researcher is going to be there leading the focus group session, interacting directly with the research participants. Same story when it comes to in-depth interviews. Same story also when it comes to observation. The researcher is very much a part of the environment or the setting where the research is being carried out. There is not that detachment. Another difference is in sampling strategies. In qualitative research, we typically do not strive for random samples because we're not trying to make broad generalizations. We're not trying to make sweeping conclusions about the overall population. And a random sample is probably not going to be the best approach when it comes to a qualitative study. For example, if you were going to do a focus group to find out how teenagers use TikTok, you're not just going to randomly grab teenagers off the street, because if you did that, you would probably end up selecting some teenagers who don't use TikTok at all. And they're not going to be of any use to you in the focus group. They're not going to have anything to say because they don't use TikTok. You would want to focus in specifically on people who actually use TikTok. So instead of using random samples in qualitative research, we are more likely to use one of the non-probability types of samples, such as purposive or snowball, or in some cases, even convenience samples. In qualitative research, the sample size tends to be much, much smaller. Rather than going for breadth and trying to reach as many people as possible for our study, the focus instead is on depth, drilling down deep and understanding people in great detail. So you might be asking, okay, sample sizes are smaller. How much smaller? How many people do you need to do a series of focus groups? How many people do you need to interview for depth interviews? Or how many people do you need to observe? Well, it's hard to give a good answer to that question because the answer is it depends. Qualitative researchers, rather than setting a specific target, rather than saying, I am going to interview 50 people, or I am going to do focus groups with 30 people, rather than setting a specific target number, what they tend to do instead is follow this principle of saturation. And what is saturation? Well, saturation is when you reach the point at which you start hearing just all the same things over and over again. You're not getting any new information. And that is a signal to you that it's time to stop, that you have gathered all of the information that you need. So you keep interviewing people or you keep observing people until you get to that point of saturation, where suddenly you're not getting any new information. And at that point, you're just wasting your time by continuing to interview or observe more people. In some cases, you may reach that point of saturation after you have a sample of 5. In other cases, you may not reach it until you have a sample size of 25. It can vary from study to study. Let's talk about how data comes into play in qualitative research. Now, I think when most people hear the word data, they immediately assume numbers. But data does not have to be numerical. Qualitative researchers still collect and analyze data. It's just that the data takes a different form. Rather than being numbers, the data consists of other things. So what counts as data in a qualitative study? Well, if you're doing observation, your data may include your field notes. So you're observing people and you're taking copious notes. Those notes become your data. Or if you're interviewing people, your transcripts of those interviews become part of your data. If you do audio or video recordings, those would also count as data, as would any documents that you might collect from the people you are studying. If, for example, you're studying the codes of ethics of different strategic communication firms, Those codes of ethics that you gather, that you collect, would become part of your data. So a qualitative researcher still works with data. It's just a different type of data than a quantitative researcher does. So once a qualitative researcher has gathered all that data, what do they do with it? How do they use that data to answer their research questions? Well, rather than running statistical tests, a qualitative researcher would sift through this data and try to identify key themes. In other words, recurring patterns. So if you're interviewing a bunch of people, you may discover as you're going through your transcripts and your recordings that what this person said sounds an awful lot like what this other person said, which also sounds an awful lot like what this third person says. So you can group those responses together into a theme. And you should start to see themes emerge as you go about that analysis. Now, as much as I know a lot of people are scared off by quantitative research, this is one of those areas where I think qualitative research is actually a lot more difficult than quantitative research. Because a quantitative researcher, once they've gathered their data, they can just run the statistical tests, and the software, a program like SPSS, will spit out the numbers for them. A qualitative researcher often needs to sift through hundreds of pages of notes or go back and listen to hours worth of transcripts and then try to figure out a way to somehow piece all this together into some kind of a coherent narrative. That's not an easy task. Qualitative research is not easy. In qualitative research, we generally don't speak of reliability and validity, at least not the way that a quantitative researcher would, because remember that reliability and validity are about measurement, and qualitative research is not about measurement. So in a qualitative study, rather than speaking of reliability and validity, we might instead speak about credibility. How can you ensure that the findings of your research are credible, that they are trustworthy, that people can have faith in your work as a researcher? Well, there's a variety of ways that you can boost your credibility, but let's talk about two of the most common ones. The first is something we call triangulation. And triangulation is when you use multiple methods of data collection. So, for example, you may conduct some depth interviews, and then you may also do some participant observation. Or you might do some participant observation and also do a few focus groups. So you're using multiple methods. And the idea here is that if each of those methods leads you to the same conclusions, produces the same findings, then that suggests that your findings are pretty strong, that you are on solid ground, and that your findings are credible. Another way to boost credibility is through the use of what we call member checks. What are member checks? Well, what you're doing here is after you've analyzed your data and you've come to some tentative conclusions, you go back to the people you studied, the people you interviewed, or the people you observed, and you actually show them your tentative conclusions. You tell them, based on the interviews or the observations I did with you, here is what I have concluded. And then you ask them, does this track? Does this make sense? Do you think I got it right? Did I capture the essence of what you or, what your group does or thinks? You're checking your conclusions with those research participants. And if they look at your tentative conclusions and say, yeah, I think you've captured it very well, then you know that your findings are fairly credible. Okay? Now, this is a little bit different from a field like journalism, for example. So, when I teach journalism courses, I tell students, do not go back to your sources and show them a rough draft of your news story, because they're going to want you to change things around. They're going to want you to clean up quotes. And before you know it, you will lose all control of your news story. But when it comes to qualitative research, we do oftentimes go back to the people we studied, show them that rough draft of our findings, and then seek their input and their feedback to make sure that we get it right. So those are some of the basics of qualitative research and how it differs in a lot of key ways from the quantitative methods that we have talked about previously.